There we go. Okay. So welcome everyone. So this is a part of our AIR seminar. We want to welcome Ekin Akyürek, who is a second-year PhD student in computer science at MIT. He is working with Professor Jacob Andreas on compositional generalization. His research focuses on building neural network models with inductive biases that support human-like generalization, for example, to support compositionality and one-shot word learning. Previously, he worked with Professor Alan Edelman on automatic differentiation and worked with Professor Deniz Yüret on sequence-to-sequence modeling and morphological analyses. He received his bachelor's degrees in electrical and electronics engineering and in physics from Koç University in 2019. So go ahead, you can take it away.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction. And today I'm going to be talking about our recent work on building sequence models that can learn from very small data sets and generalize in human-like ways. But before starting, I will try to show how we solve these tasks with a simple experiment. Now I'll show you a data set in a language you've never seen before, and we will do a little training on this data set one by one. Then we will answer some test cases together. So in this data, DAX means red circle, WIF means green circle, log means blue circle, and ZUB means yellow circle. And now we have DAX fab means 3 red circles, and LUG fab 3 blue circles, and ZUB fab 3 yellow circles. And if I ask you what does WIF fab mean, and I assume you all get the same answer as 3 green circles. Now, if I tell you that there's an unspecified circle with teal color, and if I ask you what does WFAB mean, and you probably guess the correct answer here as well. So people somehow agrees on these answers, although this is not statistically required. And the reason we are able to agree on these generalizations is because we were able to figure out this data obeys certain rules. Actually, there is only one rule that determines what fab does. And once you know this rule, you can use it to do a bunch of things. So you can use it to do fast mapping, which is learning what a word means from single example and being able to use it in other contexts. And we can even learn what a word means on the fly, and this is called mutual exclusivity. And this was an extremely easy problem, almost embarrassingly easy, but what do you think is going to happen when we train a neural network on this toy data? And if you train a sequence-to-sequence on this data set, this is the results you get. And it turns out that current sequence models like these inductive biases we have, and they fail to generalize human-like ways. So our main research question, how can we bake these kinds of assumptions into neural models? And today I will talk about 2 recent projects aimed at doing this. And I just want to note that these type of problems are neither specific to small data sets nor text-only domains. So we observe similar kind of mistakes even in extremely large models trained on extremely large data sets. Like you see here, DALL-E model from OpenAI cannot generate the image that applies to this test description. Although we don't provide a solution to this, in the very end of this talk, we will have small suggestions about this. Okay. The first part of the talk, we will see a model that tries to learn composition rules which help to build null examples out of other examples, out of other training examples. And here's an example task we will use as our running example. And this task is morphological analysis, which is figuring out what parts of word is made up and what information it carries. And like, what is the word root form of the word, what is the tense, like what is the number, and other informations as well. And we want to evaluate our models on the few-shot problem, such that in this data set, we have abundance of present tense, other tenses, but we have only a few past tense verbs. And the reality is that if you see this tense a few times, you can analyze the new past tense word comía in Spanish easily. And it's a similar problem as we see before in the color data set, and the standard models, like standard sequence-to-sequence models, are good at this. And the problem is not specific to morphological analysis or the color data set we saw. Often in other data sets like instruction following, we see this kind of patterns. So here you see a small instruction following data set, and the inputs are the comments, and the outputs are low-level actions a robot needs to take. And the outputs are converted to English-like strings here for convenience. And in this data set, we seek for similar kinds of generalizations. If somebody shows me a new action, so I should be able to use it immediately with other complicated instructions. Or if somebody asks me a new command, which is maybe the challenging combination of the instructions that I saw before, I should handle this as well. And the data set specifically evaluate these kinds of skills. Okay, but how do we achieve these skills? So although you might not know the Spanish, based on the examples I provided, you observe that there are patterns in this data set. So for example, the E ending means present tense, the EI ending means past tense, and the other parts of each word are derived from the root of a lemma. And once you figure out these little rules, even if example 2 wasn't in the training set, you should be able to figure out how to make it by putting pieces of other examples together. And therefore, maybe a good way to get these rules is to design a procedure that tries to build training examples by using the pieces of other examples like here. Then we might hope to learn these rules implicitly by this model. And if we had this procedure, we could apply them to different examples to get something new. So for example, you could also stitch the comer lemma together with the past tense suffix to create another well-formed example like in for. And the kind of copying pasting procedure is not going to explain everything in this data set. So it's probably a pretty bad sequence prediction model, but maybe we can still use this to generate more examples of rare phenomena and like past tense here. So now with this augmentation, we don't have a few shot problem anymore. So then maybe we can train a standard sequence-to-sequence model on this augmented data set, and we can achieve good results. So the question of this part of the talk, can we learn a model that discovers these rules automatically and learn to create novel examples in the same fashion, in this fashion? And then we will use this this model to augment our training data, and we'll train a standard sequence-to-sequence model. And this is a problem studied by other researchers, and mostly building on task-specific models or rule-based data augmentation models. And so there are like many previous work in recent years related with compositional generalization. And what we are trying to do is something that can scale up to natural data sets like morphology and potentially to others. And our modeling is a generalization of the prototype-based generative models, which we'll explain now. If we want to build a model that generates new points out of training examples, one possible way is take a training example from the training data and learn to change it to another example by editing the lemma or tag in particular ways, like here. And once we learn this generative process during training, we can apply same thing again and again to obtain novel samples. And we can formulate this generative process as a latent variable model. And we imagine there is an underlying strings, and it gets edited to produce the strings in our training data. So we further assume that these underlying strings are actually the other data points in the training. So then we sample our sequence from the conditional distribution, and we will get our data. So this kind of retrieve and edit models is used bunch of other NLP tasks, for example, language modeling. But let's think back to what we were actually doing with our morphology example in a couple of slides before. So we weren't just taking a single example and editing it to another example. What we actually saw was building each training example out of pieces of multiple other training examples. And the model that we had on the previous slide isn't gonna let us do this. But we can generalize the previous model into multi-prototype model. So a particular model with two prototypes is very similar to the way we constructed the examples at the beginning. So now we retrieve an example from the training set, and we retrieve another one, and then we create our sequence by combining the parts of these prototypes. Again, we are going to learn these reconstruction patterns by trying to explain every training example in combination of bunch of other examples like here. And similarly, we have a generative model here, but there are two underlying sequences right now. So there are two latent variables, as you see in the slide. And we have a recombination model which generates the target sequence condition on multiple prototypes now. And now we need to answer, how can we parameterize this recombination model or this recombination distribution? So suppose we have these two prototypes sampled, and we are generating our target tokens one by one with a sequence decoder like an LSTM. And suppose we generated the tokens you see in the output so far. And what should we do next? So the whole intuition of our model was to benefit from prototypes and to combine their tokens. So if you want to combine their tokens, so we want to allow model to copy their tokens. So the model can copy from prototype 1, the model can copy from prototype 2, and it can also copy from the previously generated tokens. So how did we do this copying? So we use attention here, and we have attention scores for each prototype tokens and for the generated tokens. Then we turn these attentions into distributions over the vocabulary. So it is just a projection over vocabulary. And moreover, we want to be able to generate a token non-exist in the current picture. So we can do this by generating a standard output distribution. We call it P right here. So the model has flexibility to not to use the prototypes and generate by itself. So in summary, this decoder is a multi-sequence to sequence model, and you could try different architectures for this part, but the copy mechanism is the key ingredient that makes this model work. And we will show this in the results section. And so now I have a generative model and I have my parameterization, but I should explain how to train this model and how to use it effectively as my new data source. And let's look at more formally to generic and prototype models. What we are doing here is optimizing a data log likelihood objective. But this objective is interactable because there is a sum over the training set to the n. So we can sum over all the prototypes like here. So, well, what we can do is we can sum over a small set of prototypes that is carefully chosen to be the right set of prototypes for each sample. So for each training example. And so this introduces a lower bound here, and we call this set the neighborhood of training example. And we will talk about this in the next slide. And now we have this neighborhood and we have our lower bound for our objective. We can further apply Jensen's inequality. And if we assume the neighborhood size is constant for each data point, we can maximize the term here independently for all data points and for all the prototypes. In summary, this boils down to standard sequence to sequence training, where the inputs are the members of the neighborhood and the outputs are the sequence that we are trying to explain. So once we train this model, we can generate new data points and we can use them in data augmentation. But what kinds of examples are we gonna get out of this model if we so think about what kind of example we will get out of this model. So if we sample naively, we will get the same kinds of examples that we trained on. So this model also will also overfit the training set. So we don't get, for example, much of past tense if we didn't see much past tenses. But what we really care about our examples that they should encourage model to generalize to rare phenomena. So here we adopt the rejection sampling so that we only keep the sample that has the rare tokens. So in other words, we contain the samples that are going to be hardest for our sequence-to-sequence model. So how can we build a good neighborhood that will produce a good lower bound? So it is very simple. So there are simple heuristics based on similarity. And the main idea in these heuristics is we want to come up with prototypes such that they can construct the target with their parts. So let's say we have a target sentence like walk around right. So what are the kinds of sentences we can construct this sentence from? So one particular way, first prototype tells me the syntax of the sentence, and the second prototype tells me a new word that I should use in the sentence, like here. So this gives me a sort of high-level template we call long short here because one of the sentences is always short in the prototype. And so this is one way, and there are other ways. And so, for example, this is another way to select prototypes. And so in this one, both prototypes are close to the target, but they are slightly different from each other and from the target, but their collective tokens comprises the target example. And we will call this long form. And again, so the details are not that important, but the main idea is both of these methods, the prototypes should be collectively comprehensive. And in our experiments, we use a mix of these. And now we are going to put all of pieces together into a procedure for getting compositional generalization in sequence models. So we first have recombination model, we train this, and we learn how to recombine training examples together. And then we do the resampling step by taking samples from recombine and then eliminating the samples that doesn't have rare tokens. And then we train a standard sequence-to-sequence model on this train augmented data, and then we'll get our final model. Now we will move on to the results. And remember the instruction following data set I showed you at the beginning, and we are interested in two particular splits from this data set. One of them was jump split, which assessed the one-shot word learning ability of sequence models. And second one is called around right, and this splits aim to evaluate zero-shot subsequence learning. So the model doesn't see around right in the training, but we ask about around right in the test. And here are the results, and we are comparing the no augmentation baseline and the rule-based data augmentation scheme called GECA. And it is surprising that if you didn't see this data set, and if you train a sequence-to-sequence model on this data, despite the fact that they are so easy, the state-of-the-art models literally get 0% accuracy. And if you use two prototype model for augmentation, you observe a dramatic increase over the baseline, and it's close to the rule-based data augmentation scheme, GECA. And this plot also shows multi-prototyping is necessary, with our intuition. So as one prototype gets here much worse than the two prototype results, we can see that our intuition was correct. And let's look at the applications for one of the splits, and we are examining the effects of copy mechanism and the data augmentation. So the augmentation, and I'll explain. We observed that the copy is a must for these results. So if you don't have copy in this decoder, you get 0 accuracy again. And remember that we have two models here. So we have the augmentation model, and we have the model that makes the final predictions, like standard sequence-to-sequence models. And some of you might thinking why this is necessary. So I have a generative model of my data, and why don't I use it directly to make an inference about conditional probability? So I could just use two prototype model to make prediction about my data. So we mentioned at the beginning, this sort of explicit recombination model might not be a good predictor. And we actually tested it, and we showed in the last part, if you use it directly, the results is significantly worse than the augmentation approach. So the teacher and student model works better than just using teacher model, in other words. And now we look at the few-shot morphological analysis results, and we have two different tenses as rare tenses, past and future tenses, and we only show 8 examples for each tense in the training. And the results are fun improvements over sequence-to-sequence baseline for the generalization sets, and like that includes past and future tenses. So the learned augmentation models with resampling achieve significant improvements over baseline, including other state-of-the-art techniques aimed at composition generalization. So they are better than baseline and the previous work. And as before, we are going to look at some ablations. And here we have an additional result. We take the resampling part. And as you can see, resampling is crucial for this task. And even though we are better than the previous work, if you combine this method together with the previous work, you can get slightly higher gains. So we ensemble GECA in our model, and we get the best scores overall. And this is the interesting part. So here's a sample from 2 prototype model trained on Turkish morphology dataset. And first, I want to point out Turkish has vowel harmony. So the vowels of the suffixes should be compatible with the last vowel of the lemma. And so the model has a challenge here, actually. And this sample is a non-exist, but certainly a valid and future tense verb in Turkish. So this is a pretty good sample. And what we observe here is that model generate a root by using write. And then it decide to copy the text from the prototypes. And then it copies root until where the suffix for future tense started. And with these prototypes, model cannot copy the vowels from either prototype due to vowel harmony. So these prototypes doesn't provide correct vowels. So, and quite interesting, the model learned to generate vowels by writing instead of the copying. And it copies the consonants from the prototypes. So this is really interesting. And as we expect at the beginning, this model actually learned to construct examples combining parts of other prototypes intelligently. And to summarize what we described here, a probabilistical generative model that generates sequences by copying fragments of other sequences at training time. And you can also think this as a disentangled, so you can think this as disentangling grammar from the meanings of atomic morphemes or tokens. So individual training examples or prototypes provide the atoms, and our recombination model learns the lexicalized rules for combining them. And here are the main takeaways for this project. So we show the multi-prototype sequence models generalizing compositional ways, and they do better when they are used for augmentation instead of inference. And resampling is very effective to promote out-of-domain generalization. And if there's any question, I can stop now and try to answer.
Okay, so let me give permission to people to unmute themselves. All right, so anyone can unmute themselves right now. And I also have a question just to start it out, actually. So can you talk a little bit about the relationship between this and envision using a simulator and using, for example, domain randomization and then training a vision model with the simulator?
Yeah, I think so. We can think recombination model may be a simulator of the data, and we are trying to learn like data generation process, and we are trying to then use it to generate additional data. So it's probably close to those methods, but I don't know the details of them. But I think, yeah, it is kind of intuitive way of thinking this.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that's like the first thing that I thought, but I guess your recombination model is, I guess, learned in some way, and there are some like sampling techniques that are more efficient than just randomly sampling, right?
Yes, if you just like use this model to generate data points naively, like without doing anything, this model also generates examples in distribution, like the terrain. So the examples will be in distribution examples. So, but we want them to be rare samples, and so we do the resampling part.
Got it.
Yeah. So we'll also continue. So I have second part of the talk, and don't leave.
Yeah, let's just
Yeah.
see if anyone else wants to ask a question.
Yeah. Hi, I have a quick question. So this model succeeds because of this data generator, or I guess my question is, does the model succeed because the data generator is very accurate and does not create kind of like nonsensical data? It seems like it's quite flexible. Or is it because the second stage of the model, which actually takes this augmented data and solves the task, is like not sensitive to poorly generated samples? I guess what I'm thinking of is in the vision domain, you might have a data generator like a GAN, but it might be hard to use that as training data because, I don't know, it generates lots of artifacts.
Yeah, it's a very good question. Actually, these results also reflects this. So if you look at two prototype inference results here, it's significantly worse than the data augmentation approach. So the generated samples are not has the same accuracy as the final model. So we have mistakes in the generated samples. And so, but the reason is, so first, so if you try to answer all the test cases with this generative model, the result is worse. But when we are sampling, we are free to sample confident examples. For example, so we can sample like 1,000 examples and we can only take the 100 of them. And if you have maybe few correct examples with the like the rare tenses or rare phenomena in this data sets, you can provide a good feedback to final model. So we show that using this model as augmentation model is better than using it directly. So the model has definitely worse predictor than the final model. So it's a very good question, actually. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but
you did. Thank you.
You can. Yeah.
All right. Anything else?
Cool.
Any other questions? I think, yeah, we can probably go to the next.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, let's just keep going then.
Yeah. So the next work focuses on even simpler way of disentangling semantics and the grammar. And remember from the color experiments from the first slides, now there's a little bit extension to it. And we added some other function words. And let's wait for everyone to solve this. So I'll wait maybe 20 seconds. So please solve this. Okay, let's see the answers here. And I'm sure you get the correct answers, but I want you to observe something more important here. So while solving this problem, which training examples did you pay most attention to? And how many times did you find yourself saying means or maps to? And I believe that you look at the first two rows many times or store them in your memory and query these individual meanings in many times. And what we realize by looking at this simple task is that explicit representations of lexical items like a dictionary play a key role in our thinking. And this leads us to a simpler model that generalizes well in multiple tasks. And again, so this intuition doesn't just hold in toy settings. So here is a more complicated linguistic analysis task where we try to map each sentence to its logical representation. And the details of this task is not important, but we can cast this problem as sequence-to-sequence translation. And I will colorize some of the tokens here. And if you look at now, like with the colors data set, you can separate most of the knowledge needed to complete the task into two things. So first, the knowledge of what individual word means. We can call this semantics. And second, the knowledge of generic rules for putting them together. We can call this grammar. And what's common in this problem, or what is important to both of these problems, a need for lexicon. So if someone gave these individual mappings, you could use them mechanistically without even knowing the meanings of the words. So if we want to think this mathematically, we represent the lexicon by a sparse matrix, as you see here. And we'll show like how this is helpful in sequence modeling. But before that, in history of language processing or parsing, there are many symbolic models that has the explicit notion of lexicon, like here. And details are omitted, but particularly in CCG parsers here, each word has a matching type and a logical form. So, and the composition operations in this parser only operates over the type. So this provides a disentanglement between semantics and the grammar. So hence they are better at compositionality. But we don't use these symbolic models anymore. And why? Because they are better at exceptions and the context-dependent reasoning. So they have hard times with idioms, like kick the bucket, I like burst into tears, and they struggle to interpret context-dependent meaning of words. And the question of this part, how can we incorporate a lexicon to a neural sequence model so that we can get best of both worlds? And let's take a step back and remember from the previous section, explicitly copying from prototypes was helpful. And we saw a generation like of two recombination model, how does it do? And it was pretty interesting. And what it does was actually delexicalizing the output production in the decoder. So it learns rules that are independent of the semantics of each token. And previous work also found that the copy mechanism is useful in sequence-to-sequence modeling. But we cannot use it when the output and input vocabulary is different, like here. So we don't have same vocabulary in the output, so we cannot copy in direct sequence modeling. And here's a sequence-to-sequence setup where we are generating output tokens one by one. And now suppose someone gave us the lexicon, like here. And how can we make the model use this lexicon? And so, well, we can do, when the model takes a copy action, we can use the lexicon to translate word instead of just copying it. So there's an intermediate step. Now we look at the lexicon and we translate the word. And this is a generalization of copy mechanism. And copy mechanism is just a specific case of this lexicon model where the lexicon is diagonal and input and the output vocabulary is the same. I hope this is clear. Not that there's still gating here. So the model is free to not to use the lexicon. So the model can work as good as the standard sequence model, if not better. Okay, this should be intuitive, but how do we learn a lexicon like I showed in this box? So, and you need to learn this lexicon from the same few-shot training data set. And fortunately, lexicon learning is easier than learning like whole task. And this is a problem studied in machine translation and cognitive science and information theory. But if you want to use an off-the-shelf lexicon technique, we can use it, and we will show like they are pretty effective and exist. But the difference is the kind of lexicon we want for our neural model is different than the previous methods. Because previous methods trying to find lexicon entries for all words. So they try to match all words to all source words to all target words. But we really just care about picking up the ones that the neural networks are bad at. So we want to map like rare phenomena again. And so we want a high precision coverage of rare phenomena, and other things can be learned by the neural model itself. So lexicon is just there to prevent overfitting. So for us, the lexicon is not the only way to generate tokens. So we have a gating mechanism and we have a standard sequence-to-sequence model. And with these constraints, there is even a simpler method than the previous lexicon learning methods, and I will show you it in a minute. So we found a very simple criteria that you can extract a sparse lexicon that is very helpful for sequence translation tasks. And let's see how this simple method works actually. So we have a training set on the left, and so the question is, when should we map an input word to output word? And a strict condition would be checking both of these conditions here, and necessary condition means whenever we see the output word W, we also see the input word V. And the sufficient condition is the other way around. And let's check an example with these conditions right now. So should I map Volk to iVolk in this data set? And yes, because they satisfy both conditions on the training data. And now let's check another example with these conditions, jump, iJump. And yes, these are also satisfied. If you were considering scan like toy datasets or color datasets, we were done here. So this two condition already provides all the necessary mappings. But now suppose there's another word, bounce, maps the same action with jump. So now this condition satisfied, and it's not. And so to prevent this, we want a relaxation. So given W, if there is no input that can satisfy both conditions, we can relax this necessary condition. And we obtain this simple logical condition to construct our lexicon. And this method is pretty bad if you want to use it just for machine translation and without a neural model, but it will help neural sequence-to-sequence models a lot, and it is really high precision. So it only gets the correct mappings. And I'll show you, in an example, how this is different than the other methods. So here you see a lexicon results from the model in a round-right version of the scan dataset. And heat map tells you which input word maps to which output word and its confidence. And if you look at the previous methods, and all of them has wrong mappings due to the correlation between around and left during the training. So they also overfitted the training set and they got the wrong mappings. But if you look at the simple method here, so we get all the required mappings successfully and they are confident. And here is the results for multiple tasks. And these orange bars corresponds to different lexicons. And they show that we are doing so much better than the LSTM in multiple data sets. And I just want to note that this approach is really robust and can work with lots of different lexicon learning algorithms. But the simple thing we described works a little bit better than the others overall. And we can see this in around right split, especially. Only the simple lexicon method is helpful as we expected. And here we use GECA, again, our baseline. And we also look at another baseline called Syntactic Attention Model. And this model has slightly similar to our model, but instead of an explicit lexicon, they learn implicit representations for each word. So I omit the details here, but we can look at the paper for this. And so our results show that explicit lexicon is better in all cases. And in addition to highly structured compositional generalization tasks, we also look at the natural low resource machine translation task here. And in an English to Chinese translation, we obtain significant value improvements in this task. And we also look at the cases in the task set that has rare words. So if a test sentence has a word that appears only a single time in the training, we consider that test case as rare. And we look at the results in the rare cases and we show much better improvements on those examples. So this method overall helps in one-shot word learning. And we also can see in this in qualitative results. So the model is able to generalize in some cases very well. And so we conclude that the sequence models actually good at compositionality when you provide this sparse but high precision lexicon. And we show that previous lexicon learning methods can already provide good lexicons, but we show that a simple lexicon learning method is surprisingly effective on multiple tasks. And I can take questions at this point. I think I was a little fast. I'm sorry about it, but I can try to answer unclear points.
Yeah, just unmute yourself if you want to ask a question. All right. Well, I'm guessing there's no questions. Yep.
Yeah. So what is next? So we've seen that it's really useful to construct an explicit lexicon and use flexible neural models to combine these lexicon entries. But the success of this approach depends on identifying the right units that go into lexicon. So this might be morphemes, words, or might be even multi-word expressions. But our current model doesn't allow this. So one direction we are interested is maybe jointly learning segmentation models with the generative models of sequences. And another direction is we assume that right way to combine these primitive items, whether in a recombination model or in a lexicon model, was just by concatenation. So we were only concatenating the tokens. So we were generating tokens left to right. But in many languages, this isn't enough. So for example, remember the vowel harmony in Turkish. So we can handle it by copying or translating. So there is two different operations required here. We need to copy the suffix, for example, and then we need to transform the vowels according to vowel harmony. So this is a different generative process, and this is non-concatenative process. So can we build neural models that has this non-concatenative generative processes like I described here? And another direction is generalizing this idea to other domains where we have same disentanglement problems. So remember the DALL-E examples in the text to image domain I showed you. So a model that didn't see a particular combination during training has hard times to generate it when we asked it. Now we have a caricature of, now we have a caricature of this lexicon, and that might help in this task. And you have coloring filters or you have shape filters. And so this lexicon maps individual words into some filters. And if the model could learn what individual word means in terms of these separate filters, maybe we could apply these filters one by one to create the required image similar to our sequence model. So we are here thinking a dynamic, maybe generative network that uses filters by looking the tokens and then using the lexicon. So, but I acknowledge this is not the same problem, and there's maybe much more going on. And for example, this model needs to decide which region to apply this filter, and there are maybe other problems, but this is just a sketch of a direction I'm currently interested. And finally, remember the mutual exclusivity in interaction. We didn't actually talk about how to do this online, and that's another important piece of this work, future work. And yeah, so this finalized my talk, and if you have questions, I can questions. And thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was great. So I'm gonna stop the recording right now.